Welcome to another episode of the Golden Hour. I'm Sharif Yunus here with Dr. Kevin Majers. Kevin, welcome.
Hello. Good to be here, Sharif.
And we're here to talk today about a topic that likely afflicts many of us. And it's a topic we're excited to talk about. It incorporates a lot of OptimalWork's principles. And that topic is, Kevin, what are we here to talk about today?
We're talking about the afternoon slump.
Okay, I don't even know
the
what
problem,
that is.
Oh, exactly.
I've never experienced
It's what happens to people that get tired in the afternoon and their quality of work goes down and they fall asleep while trying to read or trying to do things. Maybe, Sharif, this has never happened with you, but you would be one of the rare people. This had been a big issue for me when I was in college and medical school, and I'm happy to say I think I've learned to totally conquer it. So this is and the principles in conquering it are precisely the things that we're always talking about here in Optimal Work.
Yeah, and I was just kidding. I mean, I actually have struggled with afternoon tiredness myself. I notice it comes up like a lot more if I'm doing something more kind of like a passive activity, like reading or something of that nature.
Yeah.
So I try to do a little short time of reading around 5 p.m. And that can be a time where it just hits me. Like if I was coding or programming or having meetings or something, talking with people, then I'm like totally fine. But then as soon as I switch to reading, it's like I'm out.
Exactly. And most of the reading I did in college and med school, I did standing up. So there was a place where I could read and stand, and that's how I stayed awake. I'm not sure I don't have to do that anymore ever. And the other thing that is relying on coffee. There's a very interesting study about coffee in the afternoon, and I don't know how many people they had. I read this, a couple of years ago, and they were looking at what's the measurable impact on cognitive lab tests with caffeine. And this is with regular coffee drinkers. And so this is not like a new habit for them. And I think they also had naive, meaning they weren't usual coffee drinkers. So now they found in the morning when people had coffee, both groups, there was a measurable impact on cognitive speed, which makes sense that you kind of have coffee and you wake up in the morning. However, the afternoon, no impact, none. So having coffee, whether you're not used to coffee or are used to it, no measurable lab impact from having coffee in the afternoon. And after reading that, at some point I experimented with it and just had no coffee, and it was absolutely no different in the afternoon, but the morning does. So just to say, people can problem solve in lots of different ways and try to figure out how do you stay energetic in the afternoon. I think that it's just, in some ways, it's a great way of diagnosing how are you living your best practices. So that a lot of the practices we talk about in OptimalWork bear fruit in the afternoon. And also, how much are you, like you're talking about being passive in tasks? If you're passive in work, then you're going to get more tired. And so, anyway, those are the two kind of approaches that I'll be trying to go through here.
On the one hand, the best practices, and on the other hand, the relationship with challenge.
Exactly. In some sense, it's how do you remotely prepare yourself to handle afternoons well? And then how do you, in the midst of it, actually get yourself to have high energy? And that's the two ways of thinking about how to set the stage for anything. And so the best practices that make a biggest impact, I think, on afternoon tiredness, one of them is something we talk about a lot, exercise, morning exercise. For me, that was the thing that did it. Once I started really exercising about 5 times a week in the morning, the afternoon tiredness was basically gone. And it doesn't have to be much, 10 minutes with 3 30-second sprints. That's what we always talk about. 15 minutes is great, 25 minutes with a sprint, that's something like that. It doesn't have to be, again, a huge amount of exercise. If you change your exercise regimen, you might initially get more tired. And so it might take a couple of weeks if you're just starting morning exercise that you really feel it's starting to pay off in the afternoon, but maybe it's be in just a couple of days. So if you make changes, there can be a little bit of normalizing period. But so whenever you're thinking about impacting afternoon tiredness, it might take a few weeks for those changes to actually have effect.
Okay.
So that's just normal.
And then it sounds like, it might be, the tiredness might be due to a confluence of different factors. And so in your case, maybe you had other good best practices in place and it was just adding this one best practice that kind of
That's a
helped.
good point.
Whereas for another person, they might need to add 2 or 3 to really. And we're going to go through more of them too. So.
Yeah, I think another best practice that's really important that we never talk about really, but it's food. And I think that food is a big culprit in afternoon tiredness. So the fewer carbohydrates you have in the daytime, the better. And I think that you can just say that across the board, that carbs make people tired because there's a bit of an effect that carbs make insulin levels go high, and then there could be a bit of like tiredness that comes as your blood sugar levels go down. Now, that said, I don't really believe much in hypoglycemia. That's a different topic. If you're not taking insulin like medicines, generally speaking, hypoglycemia is not a big issue. Oftentimes, what people call hypoglycemia is simply tiredness, that they get tired at various times, and then they eat, and that gives them a little bit of, and often they eat something sweet to treat, and then they end up getting a bit of a boost of energy, but then they get just another crash after that. So I think that using food to give you energy is not the way of thinking of it. It's actually reducing it. One of the best practices that people can have in general for daytime eating, I think, is intermittent fasting. So we don't talk much about that.
No.
And there are good books on it, The Complete Guide to Fasting.
Could you give a 30-second or 1 minute that's basically 8 hour window each day you can eat, and then 16 hours you don't?
Yeah, it's something like that. Yep, it'd be 16 hours you don't, or maybe 20 hours you don't. And so that might mean not having breakfast or not having until 11 or noon. And then no, so it's just basically, it's not eating less, it's having longer periods of not eating. But the key thing there is understanding that what is hunger? Hunger is ghrelin, and ghrelin makes you smarter. So ghrelin makes it easier to work, easier to focus. So there's nothing about fasting that interferes with work, quite the contrary. It actually can help work enormously. And I think that ghrelin has a lot to do with it. There's not a lot. There are things that are written and published about ghrelin and the cognitive effects of it. But I think it just makes sense that, you look at the squirrels. How are they going to remember where they hid all those acorns? Well, they need to be hungry. When they're very hungry and they have lots of ghrelin, then they can remember, in a sense, more easily where they put things. And it makes sense that hunger actually would have to make us smarter and more capable of exercise. Otherwise, the human species probably would have never really gotten started. Now, that's just to say that tiredness doesn't mean that you need to be eating. If anything, it means make sure you're not having too many carbs. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of true.
And then my experience is that right around lunchtime, for lunch, if I have a big lunch, especially one with lots of carbs, like lots of bread or lots of pasta, then that causes problems. It causes problems within the hour, I would say.
Yeah, I think it does. That for me also is a big discovery in life, just to reduce that.
Yeah.
So another real big important best practice, just to mention briefly, is working with a series of sprints and breaks, so that you have total on and total off. That tends, all through the morning. So it's like if your workday starts at 9, then 9 to 10, 10:15, that's a golden hour, probably the most important one of the day. And then a total break, 10 to 15 minutes. And you come back and you have another really well-crafted hour or hour and a half or so, and then a total break. If you work in sprints and breaks, you tend to actually keep your energy level very high. Ending each hour on time, and then here's a key thing, ending your day on time. I would say if you want more energy in the afternoon, try being sure to end your workday a half hour earlier than you normally would. And try to force it as a very hard stop. So if the afternoon has nothing to push against as a kind of container, a containing wall, it's easy for the intensity of it just to go to nothing, just like kind of spill out. So, to really contain, your energy, you have to have end times. And then what normally happens when you launch into a task, at first your energy is very high and then it starts to go down. But if you know you're honoring the deadline and you're going to stop on time, then as you're approaching that deadline, there's still things you want to do and your intensity returns as the deadline approaches. And then you take a total break. Well, the whole day is like that too. And if you have a total stop time for your day, as you approach the end of the day, you get an increase in energy as you're trying to make sure you do really well all the things that you wanted to do that day. So having an end time for the day, an end time for each hour that you really honor, and then take breaks, 10-minute breaks or so, that's another way. And you could have longer breaks if you're getting tired. So, but keep the breaks. And then intense work. This is the most important thing. So I think that when people are not really challenging themselves in this hour of work, then they get tired. So it's the challenge that produces internal adrenaline that lets you then rise to it. So what would that look like? Well, if you were falling asleep while reading, let's say, you're
just as an example.
Yeah. Say you have a half hour of reading. If you think of, if you're just passively reading, then you're going to be more likely to fall asleep. If you raise the challenge level, what would that look like? Well, it might be thinking of how you could have like a 5-minute summary that you give someone at the end of that reading time. Thinking of recording it and putting it on YouTube, your 5-minute summary of what you just read. Okay, now that would require more intense engagement with that task. That you're anything that you have to set a high bar that essentially requires that all of your intelligence then is galvanized and put into this task.
That's actually a good idea. I might actually start recording a video after I read something and posting it on YouTube.
Wouldn't it force you to really understand it well?
Yeah, absolutely.
You only have now 25 minutes or a half hour to be able to read this well,
right.
And then you're going to really just totally invest yourself in it.
Right.
But that's the sense. You have to raise the challenge level in the task, and raise the quality that you're aiming for. So just if you could make sure that you could summarize everything you just read in 5 minutes, while you're reading something, what that means is quickly as you're reading, you're making sure that you have the main breakdown of the text, and then how each of those things, keywords, key definitions, key topics, interesting ideas, whatever it is, you're raising the level. It's not just reading one word after another for endless lines, but you're getting your whole. It's like if you're in a class and you're getting tired. Well, maybe the notes you're taking are the problem. If you're just taking verbatim notes, Cal Newport talks about this in his book, How to Be a Straight A Student. As you're taking notes, always be listening and categorizing what you're hearing as question, evidence, or conclusion. And so you take notes in a different way. Like if it's evidence, okay, that's one way that you write it out. And then you try to make sure you know exactly what the question is, and then what's the conclusion. And then you can go back and quiz yourself by just looking at the questions, and then see if you can come up with the evidence and conclusion on your own, just from memory. This is just saying, if you raise the amount that your intelligence is actively engaged with the task, requiring more of yourself, it's that kind of increasing the requirements of the task to raise the bar. That's what gets your adrenaline going and wakes you up and makes you totally engaged with the task. See, I think that tiredness is just what happens when your default attention isn't sure what next step to predict, and it's somehow sleep comes up as the salient next step, and then you get drawn and pulled into sleep. So you always can get around that by raising the challenge level in the task at hand. So we talk about best practices, set the stage so that you can have a good afternoon more easily. But it's the challenge that you are embracing on your own in the work in the afternoon, that is the key to completely conquering afternoon tiredness.
Okay, so you're saying that when your default mode thinks that sleep is the most salient thing, it will just pull you there. And so that I assume that would be something that you're going to be training over time too, so that the more you give in to the afternoon tiredness, say by taking a nap, or even now, what if you have like some strategy like taking a walk? Like when you get tired, you get up and you take a walk. Is that also then going to trigger the tiredness to come back in the same way that I'm thinking like taking a nap would? It makes it more salient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And this gets to how tiredness relates to two different concepts. One is how it relates to flow, and the other is how it relates to acceptance. So when you're in flow, that means that it's the next step in the task itself that is always the most salient drawing thing that pulls you ahead. And then when that step is done, then you proceed to the next one and the next one. You just get pulled through. So flow is what happens when all of your default attention, when it's looking for the next step, trying to predict what it'll be, is always staying within the task itself to do that predicting. And then it just pulls you step by step through your task. That's why we, with the golden hours, have people lay out steps in advance. It's to train your default attention to pull you correctly through. And none of those steps is sleep for 5 minutes. So when you're in flow, you're completely immune to tiredness. It's not there at all. It doesn't exist. Now, that tells me that tiredness, in fact, is just your default attention thinking that somehow rest is the next thing. Because maybe it thought that what you were doing just before that was also rest. But when you're totally applying yourself and really challenging your intelligence in the task, then it's going to tend to find the next step within the task and pull you to that and pull you to the next one. So getting into flow is the best way of not having issues with tiredness, period. But acceptance is super closely related. So what does it mean to be accepting of tiredness? I think if people go on walks or they do things to problem solve tiredness, like have more coffee or whatnot, well, they end up they end up being sensitive to tiredness as if it's some kind of absolute obstacle to them. But falling asleep while working just means your brain thought that was the next thing to do, and so it made it happen. But if you had this task itself, well, if you are able to change your relationship to tiredness through acceptance, that doesn't have to happen. So the first part of acceptance is always reframing. Now, in the case of tiredness, what are you reframing? Well, how could tiredness bring out the best in you? Chances are, if you get tired while doing something, it's because you're doing it the same old way. It's just a sign that you've been doing it rotely or to get it done. When you're doing something in a way of like really bringing your mind into it and trying to be creative, trying to be flexible, having like motives in that task that give you energy, all those right brain qualities, you could actually use tiredness as a chance to renovate your approach to work at that moment. Right? That, okay, I'm going to respond in a completely new way to this and improve the way I'm doing this task. Learn to improve the quality of the challenge in some completely new, creative way. So it's the challenge in the task that's the leading edge of growth. It is you improving how you're growing. So you want to grow through the tiredness, right? So that whenever it's there, you take it as a sign that your approach to this work needs a deep renewal. But it doesn't mean that you actually need rest or sleep. Mindfulness of tiredness is also interesting. I think in this case, it's not that you necessarily want to be paying attention to the tired feeling itself, which could be a way of giving into it, but instead, more completely getting your intelligence and your attention in the task at hand. Clarifying what exactly is a step, what exactly is the goal you're working on, so that any wandering of attention Normally, people get tired a split second after getting distracted. Another sign that tiredness is all tied up with your default attention. You get distracted for a moment, and then you get tired. Maybe you've experienced this at some point in like, it happens like if you're trying to practice some form of meditation, that if you get distracted from the here and now, then tiredness comes on the heels of that. And then the challenge is simply to raise the challenge level in the task that you're doing. So the same exact approach of acceptance comprised of reframing mindfulness challenge, that is actually precisely how you deal with tiredness whenever it shows up in the afternoon.
Wow, that's a really beautiful tie-in. I love it.
Great.
Next time I get tired, that's what I'm going to do. But hopefully there won't be a next time because I'll double down on my best practices.
You should hope there's a next time.
Oh,
and then you're going to get so good at mastering it, it's going to bring out the best in you.
I think I just missed the whole point of
Welcome it. Exactly.
All right. Well, Kevin, that's our time for this week. We'll be back next week. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Take care.
All right. See you next week.